The film's story begins in a prison. We watch three prisoners named José, Mauricio, and Fernandez. These prisoners were part of a group of other prisoners who were beaten and tortured inside this prison. Upon arrival, they are blindfolded, stripped of their clothes, and cuffed before being placed in separate cells. Almost immediately, military officers attempt to suffocate them, but the men survive, enduring pain, and forced to stand until the next morning. The following day, they remove their blindfolds and see a wall inscription warning them to abandon hope. They receive letters from the Ministry of Defense forbidding communication with each other or the guards. As they struggle to sleep, soldiers disrupt them by banging on their doors. After a year, they are transferred again, this time to a cell with a bed but still harsh conditions. The military chief visits, threatening them and calling them hostages, while warning Mauricio about his family's visits to prove that they are criminals. They were imprisoned without a court judge's order. They do not know what the verdict was issued against them. They do not know if they were sentenced to death, to life imprisonment, or to some years. But they know that they are in solitary confinement and face the most severe forms of torture. A guard comes and pours petrol on the prisoners and covers their heads with a piece of cloth so that they don't breathe easily, and he beats them until they lose consciousness. The prison director was preventing prisoners from resting and sitting down. If one of the prisoners sits, they torture him more than before. Despite all this torture, the prisoners remain. Following the visit, the men get haircuts and a chance to bathe. During a family visit, Mauricio is joyful until his father collapses, prompting him to call for help before being taken back to his cell. They are moved again to even smaller cells. As Christmas approaches, the soldiers celebrate while the three men remain despondent in their confinement. Eleuterio starts knocking on the wall to see if any of his friends can hear him. Fortunately, Mauricio is in the adjacent cell and responds, allowing them to communicate through knocking. Excited, Eleuterio wishes Mauricio a Merry Christmas using this new method. As time passes, they become more comfortable with their communication, asking each other questions and even playing an imaginary chess game by relaying their moves. One day, Eleuterio needs to use the toilet but struggles because one of his hands is cuffed to a pipe. He calls a soldier for help, but the soldier only seeks approval from a superior, leading to a lengthy process that eventually escalates to the highest prison official, who is angered by the situation. While in the toilet, Eleuterio manages to take a discarded newspaper. Upon returning to his cell, he shares the news about recent events in Uruguay with Mauricio. Meanwhile, Mujica's mental state deteriorates as he begins to hear voices and hallucinate, speaking to an imaginary version of his mother. Interestingly, Mujica's actual mother visits that day, but the soldiers deny her request to see him and leave her waiting in the rain. That night, the men are transferred to another prison where they discover rats in their cells. Although the cell is spacious, prison guards drew a shape to determine the area that the prisoner is allowed to use, and if he crosses the area he is allowed to sit in, he will be killed. The prisoners communicated with each other by hitting the wall. The men struggle to sleep as an officer, Barriola, talks loudly about a girl he likes. Mauricio interrupts, offering to help Barriola win her over if he brings him a pen and paper. Despite the soldiers' anger at Mauricio for speaking up, Barriola is so smitten that he brings the materials, allowing Mauricio to help him write a message to the girl. Afterward, Barriola leaves with the note. The next day, a group of soldiers takes Mauricio to another room, where Sergeant Alzamora asks if he's the writer who helped Barriola. Mauricio confirms he is, and Alzamora reveals he also wants to ask a girl out. Mauricio writes a letter for him, which impresses Alzamora. In a good mood, Alzamora allows Mauricio to keep the writing materials before returning him to his cell. A few days later, Alzamora summons Mauricio again, and this time he gets a proper meal. Alzamora shares more details about the girl he likes, and Mauricio helps him decide on his next steps and writes another letter. Later that day, while listening to a football match on the radio, Alzamora decides to increase the volume so that Mauricio and the other prisoners can hear the commentary. When a goal is scored, it excites Mauricio and his fellow inmates. Afterward, Mauricio finds himself writing yet another letter for Alzamora, who has received more feedback about the girl. That night, the hostages were transferred once again. During their journey, which continues into the next day, the truck stops to allow the prisoners to relieve themselves. Taking advantage of his privileges, Mauricio requests to have the cloth covering his head removed. Upon arriving at the new prison, Mauricio is given a cell with a partially open door, unlike the others. Meanwhile, Mujica struggles to maintain his sanity and has a nightmare in which a police officer kills him. Eleuterio also faces his own challenges, as he begins to reminisce about his past and imagines his wife being with him in the cell. After a few days, the prisoners are transferred to yet another prison. Despite the constant moves, Eleuterio and Mauricio manage to maintain their communication through knocking on the walls. When Eleuterio shares the news that his daughter is visiting him for the first time in a while, Mauricio comes up with a story that Eleuterio can tell her during the visit. Eleuterio enthusiastically shares the story with his daughter, who appears to enjoy it. However, their time together is cut short, and Eleuterio is taken away before he can finish the story. The following day, the prisoners are stunned when the soldiers bring in a range of unexpected items, including a table and chair, books, a radio, and even extra food, into their cells. After a few days of enjoying the unexpected amenities in their cells, the prisoners realized that this was all part of a calculated plan by the soldiers. The soldiers' true motive becomes clear. They wanted the prisoners to experience a period of relatively better treatment before their upcoming meeting with the International Red Cross Committee Review Board. When the time for the meeting arrives, the prisoners are taken to the interview session. Before going in, they are firmly warned by the soldiers not to say anything negative about the conditions of their confinement and the treatment they have received since being taken into custody. Eleuterio is the first to be interviewed, and he sees this as a chance to speak out and reveal the true suffering they have endured. However, when faced with the soldiers standing behind him, Eleuterio ultimately decides to simply answer the questions as he had been instructed, rather than telling the full truth. After the interviews, the prisoners return to their cells, only to find that the soldiers have swiftly taken away all the additional items they had brought in earlier, marking the end of the prisoners' brief respite from the harsh conditions. Several days after the initial events, the military commander arrives and requests to speak with Eleuterio. During the search of Eleuterio's room, the soldiers had discovered an unusual item, a bar of soap. Upon closer inspection, it was revealed that Eleuterio had written some kind of coded message on the soap. The military commander immediately assumes that Eleuterio is attempting to secretly communicate with someone on the outside. However, Eleuterio is able to demonstrate that the markings on the soap are simply random codes with no actual meaning. Embarrassed by his mistake, the military commander laughs it off, ruefully admitting that he regrets not killing Eleuterio and the others when he had the chance. It is then revealed that on the day Eleuterio and the others were initially apprehended, the military had just announced that they had taken control of the government in a coup. Eleuterio is later hiding in a house with some friends when he notices an eerie silence has fallen over the area. The owner of the house, likely Eleuterio's friend, decides to surrender to the soldiers. She emerges from the house, only to find the armed soldiers aiming their weapons at the building. An absolute silence falls as Eleuterio watches anxiously to see if the soldiers will accept the surrender. The soldiers begin shooting randomly, killing the woman and her husband inside the house. And although Eleuterio is caught in the crossfire, the other man with him in the ceiling remains unharmed. The military chief orders the soldiers to enter the house when they find no one else inside. They wait for higher officials to arrive. As the officials investigate, it becomes clear that the soldiers had placed guns in the hands of the deceased couple to stage the scene as if they had fired first. One soldier goes to the restroom and notices blood dripping from the ceiling, confirming that there are people hiding above. The soldier informs the military chief about what he saw in the restroom. To avoid suspicion, the chief quietly approaches the restroom. Just as he raises his gun to shoot, Eleuterio's partner shouts that they are in the ceiling and have surrendered. This disrupts the chief's plan to kill them, as two officials enter and instruct the soldiers to rescue the men. In the present, the military chief tells Eleuterio he deserves nothing but hell. Eleuterio acknowledges his mistakes and takes responsibility for his actions in the revolutionary movement. He accepts the consequences but asserts he hasn't been defeated, contrary to the chief's claims. The chief insists Eleuterio will never leave prison, equating that to defeat. Eleuterio replies that he doesn't mind dying in prison. The next day, Mujica finally sees his mother, who brings him some items. However, he isn't himself, and abruptly tells her to stop visiting, fearing they might mistreat her because of him. He expresses his struggles with hearing things and his desire to stop thinking, which consumes him in his cell. His mother pleads with him to get his mind right to avoid being killed, but Mujica feels lost and doesn't know how. During a prison event, Mujica starts shouting for the items his mother brought. As he grows louder and disrupts the event, Soldiers come to his cell to quiet him. Mujica then threatens to expose one soldier's affair by shouting details at the event, successfully getting what he wants. Concerned about his behavior, the soldiers decide to report the situation to their superiors. The next day, Mujica visits a doctor and shares his feelings, including hearing voices in his head. The doctor diagnoses him with delusional psychosis, prescribes medication, and advises him to get more sleep. Mujica insists he doesn't need sleep, but wants to read and write to organize his thoughts. She agrees to provide him with books and encourages him to hang in there, suggesting his ordeal is nearly over. Soldiers prepare to watch the election results aimed at restoring democracy. Despite the loud TV, the prisoners struggle to hear. Eleuterio asks Mauricio about the results, but neither knows. They soon learn of the outcome when soldiers angrily storm in to beat them, despite their innocence. A few days later, the prisoners are transferred to another prison, where they can walk under supervision. Mujica also receives the books promised by the doctor. Prisoners are moved to a new facility, which happens to be Alzamora's prison. Mauricio is pleased to see the sergeant, who reveals that he has married the woman Mauricio helped him write to. Feeling grateful, Alzamora offers Mauricio anything he wants, and Mauricio asks for time in the yard with his friends. That afternoon, the three men reunite for the first time in years. They are returned to their original prison, which has improved facilities, and they receive their uniforms back. As they are taken to another section where similar prisoners are housed, Eleuterio takes the opportunity to move around and pretend to play football. The men are set for release, with Mujica being the first to go. As he exits, he is asked to sign a document confirming he was treated well during his imprisonment. Despite knowing they were mistreated, Mujica reluctantly signs, as it's the last step to his freedom. The soldier in charge threatens him one last time, warning that they will keep track of him. Eleuterio and Mauricio are also about to be released. Soon after, he and Mauricio board a bus heading to a crowd eagerly awaiting their return. After a long journey, they finally reunite with their families after years in solitary confinement. Eleuterio becomes a senator and defense minister. Mauricio becomes a poet and novelist. And Mujica is elected as a congressman before becoming the president of Uruguay in 2010.